So we're now going to move on to a talk, self-confessed old school, no PowerPoint, from Bob Sharf. Dr. Sharf is the D.H. Chen Distinguished Professor of Buddhist Studies at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and chair of the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. And I had the pleasure of having my mind, head, brain, life opened by a deep encounter across the span of last spring at a wonderful seminar that Evan taught, and Bob was a highly constitutive of the consequence of that course. Bob, it's a pleasure.
So thanks, Cliff, for inviting me, and to all of those who have made this possible. Thanks a lot. So there's been a considerable discussion and debate of late concerning the relationship between the forms of meditation practice being promulgated in the West today and traditional Buddhist meditation techniques. Are they ultimately oriented toward the same goal, and does it even matter? Might an understanding of Buddhist history and doctrine help one to understand and evaluate the therapeutic effects of contemporary mindfulness training, or is Buddhism now beside the point? But wherever people stand in this debate, there seems to be an agreement that the issue of religion is irrelevant. Mindfulness isn't religion, and Buddhism isn't either. The thinking is that once you strip away the cultural accretions and see beyond the stultifying panoply of myths, creeds, rituals, and institutions, Buddhism is found to be more of a philosophy, or a therapy, or a spiritual discipline than a religion. So whatever the relationship may be between mindfulness and Buddhism, religion is simply immaterial. Now, there's a vast gap between the way people today, including many academics and intellectuals, understand the term religion and the way specialists in the history of religion approach it. In popular culture, religion is about faith and belief, about accepting as true things that have no empirical foundation. It is about the belief in the power of gods and supernatural forces, belief in the historical veracity of ancient myths and legends, and so on. Secularists regard religions at best as outdated attempts by our pre-scientific ancestors to render the world meaningful. At worst, religions are superstitious nonsense promulgated by those who would prey on the credulity of the masses. Now, this view of religion as pertaining to belief, faith, and personal experience, of being a matter of the heart, as it were, has been embraced by moderns of all stripes, whether they are for or against or indifferent to religion. I would include here biologist Richard Dawkins, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, the anthropologist Pascal Boyer, the literary critic and journalist Christopher Hitchens, the linguist Steven Pinker, and so on and so on. All of whom associate religion with the benighted belief in supernatural beings and implausible cosmologies and nutty doctrines. Now, these public figures have given this understanding of religion the aura of intellectual credibility. But specialists in the field have long insisted that this is simply wrong-headed. Now, I'm thinking of Talal Asad, Tomoko Masazawa, Brent Nongbre, Robert Orsi, Jonathan Z. Smith, and others. They've all argued that this way of thinking about religion is modern and is based on a single outlying case, namely Protestantism. It is Protestantism, particularly in its early modern incarnations, that emphasizes doctrine and faith. It is Protestantism that privileges inner dispositions over outward practice, or orthodoxy over orthopraxy. So if we want to understand religion anthropologically as a human phenomenon, we need to see beyond this Protestant bias. Now, some have concluded that the category of religion is in the end a modern construct and of limited utility. I don't agree with that, but I'm not going to go into that here. I'm going to jump right into the founders of the modern social sciences who were very much focused on religion, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and their intellectual heirs. They based their doctrines on a very diverse body of data, namely the ethnographic reports that were pouring in from the European colonies from around the globe. These scholars argued that in order to understand religion as a cross-cultural, if not universal phenomena, we must focus not on the private experiences of individuals, but rather on the complex dynamics of social groups. The individual, the ego, even the cogito, or the center of subjective experience, emerges within a complex social matrix comprised of family, extended kinship structures, political and economic exchange relationships, semiotic systems, and so on. You'll see why this dovetails nicely with Evan's paper. These form the socio-cultural superstructure without which simply there is no individual. And religion, according to these pioneering scholars, plays a vital role in the homeostatic regulation of this dynamic system. This superstructure is logically prior to, or to use the Kantian term, transcendental to one's personhood. It does not disclose itself to introspective inquiry directly, since the superstructure is what makes introspection and reflection possible in the first place. As such, if you want to understand religion, don't focus on individual faith or doctrine or spiritual experience, but look at religion's function in the maintenance of this larger constitutive scaffolding. Now, as an aside, I'd note that it's curious that Buddhologists, sympathetic to the Buddhist doctrine of non-self, turn to phenomenology for tools to help make sense of this doctrine, the doctrine of non-self, rather than to classical sociology, which would give them, I think, a lot more to work with. In any case, one modern heir to this tradition, the American sociologist Peter Berger, talked about religion as a sacred canopy. Building on the work of Durkheim, Weber, and Hegel, among others, Berger began with the notion that since this scaffolding, or the political, social, cultural institutions that shape our lives, is a dynamic social construct, it is inherently unstable and retains its seeming integrity only insofar as it can compel consent. And to be compelling, it must appear not as the precarious chimera that it is, but as an enduring truth rooted in the natural order. We must have some tacit confidence in the perduring rightness and probity of the social order, lest we lose our sense of ourselves as rational agents whose lives have meaning and purpose. And even more basic, without widespread compliance, the cultural, economic, and social structures that make our form of life possible would simply collapse. Crops would not be harvested, children would not grow into adults, adults would not reproduce, and so on. But there are moments in everyone's life when one may realize, if only in passing, that the world is not as it seems, when one sees through the seeming stability and naturalness of the ideological and institutional structures that shape our self-understanding. The death of a loved one, the senseless suffering of the innocent, the horrors of disease and war, all these can lead one to question the nomos, or the normative order. So too can ecstatic experiences, altered states of consciousness, brought about by asceticism or mental illness or psychotropic drugs. This loss of confidence in the normative order, the sense of seeing through the veil, can engender a sense of meaningless moral paralysis and anomie. This in turn can lead to depression or paranoia on the one hand, or social and political rebellion on the other. In either case, it poses a threat to the integrity of the status quo. So according to Berger, religion works to safeguard the superstructure by creating a sacred canopy that protects against tears in the fabric of the nomos. This is why religions are so concerned with suffering and death, with questions of injustice and theodicy, and with the significance and management of ecstatic experiences. In place of anomie and disintegration, religion affords meaning and communitas. The incontrovertible evidence all around us may be that life is, to quote Hobbes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, but religions counter with a perspective that contains and manages disillusion. They proffer a world that has order and meaning and gives us a place in which to situate ourselves. Now, I would note that this is a great simplification. It's almost a caricature of the work of Peter Berger and others in the field. And I would also note that Berger got a lot of things wrong. Perhaps his greatest mistake was his prediction back in 1967 that religious ideologies would disappear in the face of modernity. As Europe and America became more culturally diverse and as scientific rationality spread, Berger predicted that religious teachings would appear increasingly implausible, leading to widespread disenchantment and secularization. But the inexorable march towards secularization never materialized. Indeed, since the 1970s, with the possible exception of Western Europe, religion seems to have seen a remarkable resurgence. Indeed, there has been a notable rise in fundamentalism and scriptural literalism that seems utterly incommensurate with the secular modes of critical reasoning and scientific inquiry that surround us. Something was deeply amiss with the secularization hypothesis, if not the sociological understanding of religion on which it was based. Now, there have been many attempts to explain the perplexing rise in religiosity that has taken place over the last few decades. And I'll focus on only one, by the sociologist and scholar of American evangelicalism, Christian Smith. Smith believes that Berger underestimated the importance of in-group membership in the social construction of personal identity, particularly given the American historical experience. Smith's theory, in short, is based on the premises, and here I quote, that human drives for meaning and belonging are satisfied primarily by locating human selves within social groups that sustain distinctive, morally orienting collective identities. And more to the point, social groups construct and maintain collective identities by drawing symbolic boundaries that create distinction between themselves and relevant outgroups. In other words, Berger believed that the plurality of religious options would undermine their plausibility, subverting their respective claims to exclusive truth. They cancel each other out, as it were. But for Smith, far from being corrosive to the survival of religion, this plurality is precisely what makes religious identity attractive. That my in-group has very different belief systems from those of our neighbors doesn't cause me to question my beliefs, but rather it gives me a clear sense of my own identity and personhood. Smith believes that Berger got something else wrong as well. Berger believed that the power of religion to elicit unquestioning consent was tied to one's religious identity being ascribed at birth. So in earlier times, it was simply part and parcel of the socio-cultural world in which one's identity was formed. The modern rise of the religious marketplace and the freedom to choose or reject a religion at will should, according to Berger, undermine the plausibility of religious truth claims and religious ways of life. But Smith argues that, in America, the ability to freely choose one's religious identity actually contributes to its appeal. He writes, I'm quoting, "Because the socially normative basis of identity legitimation are historically variable, modern religious believers can establish stronger religious identities and commitments on the basis of individual choice than through ascriptions," end quote. In other words, given our modernist attitudes and epistemic commitments, freely choosing membership in a subgroup that maintains odd beliefs and peculiar practices is precisely what makes me authentic and morally principled. Smith concludes, modernity can actually increase religion's appeal by creating the social conditions that intensifies the kind of felt needs and desires that religion is especially well positioned to satisfy. So he calls this his social identity theory of religious persistence, which claims that religions survive and thrive in pluralistic modern society by embedding itself in subcultures that offer satisfying, morally orienting collective identity, which provides adherence, meaning, and group belonging. So the popularity of mindfulness practice is often seen as a response to the overwhelming stresses and strains of modern urban life. According to this narrative, the values, goals, and pleasures to be gained from participation in consumer culture or from advancement in career and social standing, or from financial success, those pleasures are vapid and unsatisfying. There's a yearning for spiritual fulfillment, for individual connection to the real and an orientation to life that brings a sense of meaning and purpose. But traditional religious practice is losing its appeal, particularly to a certain largely white, secular, educated, and culturally advantaged social group, as it requires commitment to belief systems and cosmologies that no longer seem viable. So they turn to mindfulness, which is not a religion, and hence it isn't a matter of belief or doctrine. Mindfulness is a therapeutic technology that has the power to transmit a profound and life-changing experience, a spiritual reorientation without any religious strings attached. At least that's the story that is being told. The problem with this story is that it fails to recognize the existential source of our suffering, of our dukkha. The more fundamental issue, I would suggest, is a breakdown of a viable proximate community or sodality capable of sustaining a sense of selfhood and personal identity. We Homo sapiens started out in small hunter-gatherer groups, which gave way to small cooperative agricultural settlements and villages. For tens of thousands of years, we evolved in small tribes surrounded by multi-generational extended families. As societies grew in size and complexity, new institutions arose that served as surrogate tribes within which we could situate ourselves and orient our lives. We have clans and castes and guilds and local temples and churches and so on. But the appeal of such surrogates is on the wane in modern America. We're a culture that glorifies individual initiative and self-sufficiency, and we disparage those who would unquestionably acquiesce to a preordained social role. So the tribal village is long gone. The extended family is at death's door, and now with the rapid rise in divorce rates, even the nuclear family is threatened. So the result is a plague of loneliness and isolation endemic in modern urban life. And of course, this will come as news to nobody here. It's been the subject of much public commentary and hand-wringing for some time now. But to take social construction seriously is to recognize that the collapse of the social scaffolding leaves people not only alone, but also fragmented, traumatized, and adrift, with little sense of place, self, or purpose. The dissolution of the social structures in which Homo sapiens evolved over the millennia is responsible for the current pandemic of depression and post-traumatic stress. For many among the educated urban elite in this brave new world, the option of membership in church, synagogue, or temple, which for several centuries of American history was de rigueur, is no longer attractive. Various alternatives have emerged to take the place of religious affiliation. There are the ubiquitous writing groups and reading clubs and birding societies, yoga classes, meetups, volunteerism, and on and on. But these confraternities don't quite cut it either. They lack the spiritual depth or shared moral vision and collective purpose that comes from being connected to a transcendental order. The mindfulness movement, which with its promise of spiritual depth without the religious trappings, seems to have arrived at precisely the right moment. Like religion, it promises access to the real, but its promises are based not on the authority of sacred scripture or on tradition or ecclesiastic authority, but on personal experience warranted by empirical science. You do a retreat, join a local sitting group, read a few books, identify with a particular teacher or technique, make new friends, find a new sense of hope, validation, meaning, purpose, and maybe even wonder and enchantment. You see my point. People assume that the therapeutic effects of mindfulness must be due to the technique itself and the technique's ability to effect psychological and neurological changes. Researchers raise money for scientific research and devise sophisticated methods to peer into the recesses of the brain to see what is going on. They use imaging technology to map the neural circuitry, interviews and questionnaires to elicit the phenomenology of meditative states, longitudinal studies to track the effects of meditation, and so on and so on. But perhaps they're looking in the wrong direction. They're looking down the wrong end of the telescope, as it were. An equally plausible explanation for the salubrious effects of meditation may be right in front of our noses. It is the therapeutic consequences of membership in a community, even if a virtual one, that espouses a set of values and life-affirming orientation congenial to modern educated elites. Membership in this sodality involves adopting a relatively simple practice that promises to cure whatever ails you, and perhaps even to disclose the true nature of self and world. Practitioners are elevated and affirmed not through the kind of neurological changes that might be detected with an fMRI, which is not to deny that such changes occur, right? But through adopting a new worldview and identifying with an in-group that affirms and supports it. In short, it is reintegrating into a nomos without which we are quite literally nothing. To conclude, modern mindfulness practice may be traced to early 20th century innovations in Burmese Buddhism, the lay meditation movement associated with Ledi Sayadaw, Mahasi Sayadaw, Goenka, and others. But somewhere along the way from Burma to MBSR and MBCT, the practice dropped two of the three jewels, namely the Buddha and the Sangha. And modern practitioners have a conflicted relationship with the Dharma as well. But while American mindfulness may no longer be Buddhist, from a sociological perspective, it still functions in many respects as a religion, providing people with a world-affirming orientation to life, and just as important, a sodality within which they can rediscover a sense of personhood, agency, meaning, and purpose. The existential solace offered by membership in this sodality may go a long way to explaining the therapeutic effects of mindfulness practice. In other words, the technique may work in the same way that prayer, image worship, ascetic practices, and other forms of religious ritual work. They literally embody and affirm one's communal identity and place in the cosmos. This social dimension may be more salient to our understanding of contemplative practices than anything that could be glimpsed with brain imaging technology. And unless we find a way to incorporate the role of the antecedent life world, or the Lebenswelt, or what in Buddhism is called the bhajana loka, into our understanding of selfhood and personal experience, our assessment of the causal mechanisms associated with mindfulness may be wildly off-base. Thank you. Good time.
So we have time for some questions for that wonderful, provocative talk.
So first I just am floored by the structure of your talk. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. The question that I have is, I feel like a lot of what happens is we skip over what to me is the really obvious thing, which is like there are these thoughts and insights that people claim or appear to have, say, in meditation. And I wonder if you could just speak to the role of that level, right? Sort of beyond just like the sort of like neural weightlifting, right, to the sort of realm of the mental.
Maybe I'm just spaced at the moment. I'm not sure I'm getting your question.
So I'll put it more pointed. So you may have an insight while meditating. It's a thought, a mental realization, right? That's helpful. That reduces your suffering. You do better. And I feel like you're focusing very much.
Maybe I do want to be clear that I'm not saying mindfulness doesn't work. I'm saying the opposite. Mindfulness works, but not for the reasons necessary, or at least not in the ways that the current scientific approaches to mindfulness are normally getting at. But I'm certainly not. I mean, this is based on a sociological understanding that is very much tied to the kind of embodied approach that Evan is talking about. So you get all sorts of looping here, and it's in no way denying the reintegration or the reappropriation of this constantly evolving and dynamic social situation. So of course it's going to appear phenomenologically as insight. Is that what you're getting? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the insights are real. It's just in a sense, if you're interested in the causal chain that led to those insights, it's where are you going to turn your microscope?
Oh, hi. I'm so excited to hear that. I'm a sociologist, so it's fun to hear you all bringing in community. I think it's really important. I think one thing that some of the neuroscientists and psychologists might also be interested in is, well, okay, so how can we study this? And I think one of the big empirical questions like your talk raises is, okay, well, are people, for the most part, practicing mindfulness in communities then? Or are they learning it and then practicing on their own? And what are the different implications of those different kinds of practices? So that's one way that we could study it. And also, I think I really liked how you brought in Christian Smith and Peter Berger, but it seems to me that a really important level of analysis was missing, which is like looking at those meso-level structures. And so, for example, looking at evangelicals in America is like really different than looking at secular spirituality in Scandinavia. And what are those different, community groups and meso-level structures that exist in the different contexts, coming back to what Evan was saying. So, I think that you're on a really great new path, but I think there's some stepping stones in the middle that should be thought about and put in place as well. So thank you both for your talks.
I should say that, when I learned Buddhist meditation, it was always in the context of groups and, monastic groups and whatever. And so I was sort of proceeding along those lines, and I gave this paper to my wife to look at, and she said, you don't get it. People aren't necessary. That's not many people's exposure to mindfulness anymore. It's in private therapy. They're talking to a cognitive therapist, and that therapist starts teaching them a bit about mindfulness. So,
that was a very interesting talk. Thank you. So you are sort of talking about how people in, for example, the United States, sort of create community in the context sometimes of individual meditation, and that the community, even if it's sort of a virtual community, is the important or an important part of the apparent beneficial effects. But in traditional Buddhism, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism and other ones, people spend long periods of time alone meditating, sometimes for years, for example. And that's not a context where people necessarily don't have access to a community that is sort of in line with those kinds of beliefs and approaches. So I'm wondering how you understand in more traditional societies this kind of long periods of isolation.
Yeah, I think it's that's a whole separate thing. In short, though, if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, traditional Tibetan Buddhist, your religious ascription, or this sodality, is not predicated on the technique or the meditation you're doing. So, in a sense, it's irrelevant to the kind of argument that I'm giving. Now, how isolating yourself and doing meditation, I mean, actually, Berger, it's back in '67 in his Sacred Canopy, he has a little fascinating page on asceticism, what he calls masochism, and what the eradication of self, how the eradication of self actually serves the perpetuation of a transcendent nomos. So he sees the two, including the separation of oneself from the community and the effacement of self. What it's actually doing is reinforcing the reality of something greater. And it's that greater that I'm actually serving when I'm off in my cave. So he has a sociological account which you can accept or argue with. A lot of people have tried to unpack that one.
Thanks so much. Really awesome. A question kind of from the Buddhist side. I can take as an implication from your talk and from Evan's as well, a sense of mind and mindfulness as a meme, and self even as socially constructed, or even as a social phenomenon, more perhaps than an individual phenomenon, or that the sense that it's individual is a modernist sense or a Western sense in this particular way. If that's so, and it is so in my own understanding, then that reframes for me a traditional insight, like the insight into not self, coming from kind of what you were just saying, so that the way that I'm going to practice and as a teacher, the way I'm going to teach students to practice toward the classical Buddhist insights is going to be different because they live in a socially fragmented context rather than in a much more homogeneous or intact, if I want to make that judgment, context. So this understanding not only lets me understand kind of who we are, but it also for me reframes how I have to meet the instructions and the doctrine toward a really classical insight like this. And just any of your thoughts?
Yeah, no, just briefly, I remember Robert Bellah giving a talk at Zen Center many years ago in San Francisco, where he was saying, he was just talking about the difference between in Dogen's day and the students that Dogen would have had, who just given Japanese social structures. Many anthropologists would disagree with Bellah, but there is this notion that in a traditional pre-modern Japanese culture, there was much less of a sense of self. And that what Dogen actually had to do was give people a sense of self in order that he could undermine it. And so we're coming from a very, very different place. In contemporary American individualism, we have a very different conceptual construct of what it is to be a self than pre-modern Buddhists in traditional societies would have had.